Hey guys, Sean Strong here with the Masculine Mission. It's great to be back with you again. So we're going to start to dive a little bit more deeply now into the Masculine Mission. I want to talk about the Masculine Mission, what it is, and about the purpose of the podcast and the purpose of where we're going and our values. We're going to start jumping into that stuff, but it never hurts for me to restate this. And that is that not everything we talk about in this podcast is always going to be just about dudes. It's not always going to be about masculinity. It's not always going to be about pulling your pants up around the house and showing somebody who's boss, It's not always going to be like that. And the reason is that masculine mission really and godly masculinity finds its foundation and its basis in who we are as disciples of Christ. And that's why so often we're going to be talking about things that have to do with developing the inner man. We're going to be talking about things that develop our spirit, that helps the inside of us grow, our spirit grow in such a way that it, again, provides that foundation so that the way that we walk out our masculinity is grounded in the Word of God, grounded in who we are as a disciple, grounded in who we are as sons of God. So there's always going to be a mixture of that. And I think that's going to be a good thing. So we're going to have a bunch of discipleship. We're going to have some purely man stuff as well. And today we're going to start jumping in again to a little bit more of the specifics of the masculine mission. So here's the mission of the masculine mission. The masculine mission calls Christian men to reject weak and self-serving masculinity and instead embrace a manhood that brings strength and safety and life to the world around them. And already you can see that this is different than the typical way that masculinity is walked out. That doesn't mean that every guy that's not part of the masculine mission or hasn't bought into it is doing it grossly wrong or being horrible. But oftentimes, masculinity is not talked about in these terms. One, a masculinity that brings strength and safety and life to the world around them. So the masculine mission is going to be a little bit unique from that perspective, but God didn't call us to be like everybody else. He called us to follow Him and walk masculinity out the best we can according to what I believe we're going to see as His design in the Scriptures. And the purpose of the masculine mission is to awaken and restore a vision for life-giving masculinity. To awaken or restore, because the reality is, as I said, this vision doesn't exist for everybody. So for some people, this is going to be an awakening to a whole new idea about what masculinity is about. And there might be some others where, this will refresh something that's already in them or something they've learned way back when or again, something that's lingering elsewhere. But for some people, it's brand new. Other people, it's a restoration of a vision for life-giving masculinity. And that's a masculinity where every man lives with identity and purpose and commitment to bring strength, safety, and joy to the world around him. The guy on masculine mission is going to understand, one, absolutely who he is, and he's going to understand why he has a purpose. This is one of the things I love about this, is that we begin to unpack this a little bit more. We'll see that every single man, not just the outdoorsman, not just a guy that carries a concealed weapon, not just a guy that lifts or whatever, right? It's not just certain men that have a masculine mission. Every guy does. And so that's what we want to be able to reinforce and kind of, pull the covers back on so we can see better that every guy has got identity. And hopefully identity in Christ. Every guy has got purpose because every man has got a masculine mission to walk out. And then each one of those from that place is going to have a commitment to bring strength, safety, and joy to the world around him. Man, there's goodness in masculinity, man. It is good to be a man that's walking it out. Now, in the first episode, if you haven't listened, it's probably going to be worthwhile to go back and check that out. In the first episode, I shared how I started wrangling with how my masculinity fit, particularly the grittier parts of my own masculinity, how that fit into the Christian faith and into ministry. And that started a few years ago. Again, I'll rehash just a little bit, but it wasn't until I got into vocational ministry that this occurred to me. Because prior to that, man, I had never compared myself to a pastor. I was a lay leader. I'm a guy that's been doing ministry stuff for a long time, but never gotten a paycheck for it. But man, once I had the title, once I had the job, and they said, "Oh, you're a pastor now." It was at that point when I realized how different I was, or at least how different I felt from some of my counterparts, other guys that have been in ministry a long time. And that's when I began to start to take a closer look. And I compared myself to them. Listen, that's not all bad, right? Because if something's important to you, you want to take time and look at it. You want to study. You want to think about these things and be careful. So it wasn't all bad that I began to see or sense, hey, how I measured up. Because the reality is, some of the things that I'm learning even now as I'm with you guys. Sometimes I look at some other friends that are pastors and guys, there's still some areas that I need to grow in. I could grow in tenderness in some areas. I could be a little less coarse in some of my ways. I don't know when or how that's ever going to happen, because the reality is, is if you go back and listen to that first podcast, you'll catch it. Because the truth is, man, if I get too sweet, there's a whole lot of guys going to stop relating to me. And I really want to relate to the everyday man. I want to relate to the guy that doesn't have it all together. I'm not putting on any airs. I am who I am. What you see is what you get. I'm not making myself more coarse than I normally am for someone's benefit. But I recognize that God has created us all kind of uniquely. He made me Sean Strong. He didn't make me somebody else. He didn't make me that sweet guy. But that doesn't mean I don't have some areas that I need to grow in. So point is, it's not bad for us to take a look at ourselves. And I want us to catch this, that, the way that I began to examine myself and compare myself to some of these other pastors, it's not just something that a minister or a pastor does. Because this masculine mission is for every man. You guys have probably heard me say it before, but the masculine mission is for the roofer, for the architect, for the student, for the skinny guy, for the fat guy, for the married guy, for the single guy, for the avid outdoorsman, for the avid indoorsman. The masculine mission is for every single man, but because it's for every single man, it means every single man is at some point or another going to find himself going through some similar things that the rest of us are. And that is that, man, unless we're asleep at the switch, if you're a Christian, unless you're asleep at the switch, or honestly, if you're really not a Christian at all, you're going to find yourself at some point starting to examine your own life. And examine your own masculinity, or maybe even the lack thereof, to see what fits and honors God and what doesn't. Again, when I mention here that we're going to be talking about discipleship things, we're going to be talking about growing in our faith things. Why? Because each one of those, as we look at the Word of God, we're going to have to examine what the Word of God says and prescribes for us and figure out, okay, how do I measure up here? Sometimes we're going to have to make some changes. Don't be just a hearer of the Word, be a doer of the Word. We want to be guys that, one, we're understanding the Word, we're listening, we're hearing, we're reading, but we also want to be guys that are doing. And that is when God says, I got to get my rage under control, when God says I shouldn't have a potty mouth or be checking out chicks, okay, I don't want to just hear that stuff. I want to be a doer best I can. And sometimes that's a bit of a process. But the point is, we're all going to find ourselves examining our lives to include our masculinity, because that's what happens when we look at the Scripture. So listen, whether you're a pastor or otherwise, your masculinity and your expression of it is no exception to that. It has to be examined. And it's important because we want it to line up and we want it to honor God and to be walked out best as we can understand how God wants us to walk it out. One of my pastors and mentors, Mike Romberger, good friend of mine, I love that he's a guy that's done a ton. He's like pastor in a mega church. This guy is a stud. He's done a ton of neat things. But he's been honest with me. He said, Sean, sometimes I wish that there was more written about, remarrying after divorce. I wish there was more written about some of these other things. And when it comes down to masculinity, we don't have a laundry list. We don't have one certain chapter and verse that we're able to go to and figure out, hey, here are all the boxes that we need to check. I, like Mike, would say, man, I wish there was a little bit more written about masculinity and how we walk these things out. But we're going to get there. The Scriptures are going to help us get there. But we're always going to have to be taking a look and seeing where we measure up. But listen, let me just ask a question. And some might ask, maybe, fine, masculine mission, Christianity, discipleship, got it. But what if you're not a Christian guy? Is the masculine mission only for Christians? And I would say, well, ... no, right? So I can shorten that. Well, no, the masculine mission, I don't believe is only for Christians, but there are going to be some, to use computer speak, some compatibility issues that are going to come up at one point or another. And here's why. The idea behind the masculine mission, as I'm presenting it, is that men have an accountability to their Creator and to His purposeful design when He created us. What I mean is that, that we would believe that our Creator has the ultimate authority to determine the conduct of our life, meaning the way that we walk it out, that our Creator has the ultimate authority to determine the conduct of our life, and as such, He's able to have expectations of us. We're trying to answer the question, can a non-Christian man be on the masculine mission? Yes, but this is all based on the idea that God created us, God has a design, and we have accountability to Him. So let me just use a metaphor on this. For the Christian guy, God is on the throne of their life. Imagine that you've got a throne that represents your life. For the Christian, God is sitting on that throne. Now, that doesn't imply perfection, right? It just means that I'm not confused. There's no struggle here about who is boss. There might be a struggle in me being perfectly obedient, but I know that He's the one that I've said, Father, you be on the throne of my life. And that's the way it is for the Christian man. But for the non-Christian man, he's got a throne too, but he's the one on the throne of his life. God's not calling the shots. He's calling the shots. Otherwise, if he surrenders his life to Christ, he gets himself off of that throne, he puts God up on that throne or asks God to take the throne, well, now he's a Christian. But the Christian, until he surrenders his life like that, until he surrenders the throne, he is on the throne. So they don't necessarily sense that same accountability to God. And here's the thing, the only reason that matters is a masculine mission is going to require some of us to surrender some things we may not want to, right? There's some things that come very naturally. I keep on whipping on this, but it's my thing. I've told you guys before, what have been some of the enduring challenges in my life, or the fight of my life, as I've called it. You know, my challenges are things that seem to kind of be a consistent thread every now and then in my life is going to be rage and ego. Those are those two things that I find I have to push back on occasionally, but I've had to push back occasionally over the course of a bunch of years. So the masculine mission is going to require us to surrender some things. Those are some things that I have to surrender as part of my walking out this masculine mission. I can't mix up this masculine mission with my own rage. Because what is rage? Ultimately, rage is going to be anger out of control. It's going to be strength out of control. And God has expressed to me that, Sean, this is not for you. You can't, even though that may come very naturally for you, this is a no-no for you. And I would say it's a no-no for you guys as well. And you guys, all of us, are going to have different things potentially. A lot of them will be common. But we all may have different things that God is going to say, hey, I'm going to ask you to surrender this to me because it doesn't align with the Christian life that I've called you to. It doesn't align to masculinity. And that's why it matters who's on the throne and who's under whose authority and who we're accountable to. Because the masculine mission is going to say, you know what? You're going to have to surrender some stuff if you want to do it God's way. And the non-Christian may not be at the point that they want to do that. And I would tell you this, that it's at that point that the masculine mission for the Christian and the non-Christian, it's at that point that those things might diverge. However, guys, I would say that I believe an even non-religious guy can pursue the masculine mission and use their masculinity as a force for good. I really do believe that. And that's why not all cops and firefighters and doctors have to be Christians in order to do good in the world. There are many people that don't know God that are doing good in the world. And that's why I think many men, religious or not, can be on this masculine mission. There just may come some points where there's some limitations. Because here's the thing. Why does that happen? How is it possible that the average guy can still do some good in the world? It's because God has given everybody a built-in moral compass of some sort. And unless some guy or gal has given themselves over to evil so much that their conscience is completely scorched, many can do good. Many can live a life that is guided by good morals, that respects their fellow man, that respects women. Now, none of those things will get them or anybody into heaven, right? All the good behavior in the world and good morality in the world. Listen, you can have all those things and be sliding to hell in a grease pole, because the truth is nobody gets into heaven on the basis of what they do or being good. We only get into heaven by asking God to wash us of our sin. We only get into heaven by allowing Him, asking Him to be on the throne of our life, to forgive us of our sin. We accept His free gift of grace. That's how we get into heaven, man. We can't get into it by good deeds, by giving money or doing any of those other things. So, that's important to know. But I think that the average person can live a good life guided by morals. They can be on masculine mission. It just doesn't get them or anybody else into heaven. But they can still do some good. So enough on that. Let's talk about the masculine mission itself. I'll read it for you again here. The masculine mission calls Christian men to reject weak and self-serving masculinity and to embrace a manhood that brings strength, safety, and life to the world around them. So let's talk about this. What is weak and self-serving masculinity? If the idea that the masculine mission calls men to reject weak and self-serving masculinity, let's figure out what that is. And a lot of this stuff is going to be intuitive, but hey, it's a podcast about the issue and we're going to talk about it. So what is weak and self-serving masculinity? A lot of you guys might remember this. There was a Gillette, the razors people. They did an ad, I think it was during the Super Bowl back in 2019, and it was called The Best a Man Can Get. And maybe it was followed by a question mark, I'm not sure. But that ad, and go back and check it out on YouTube. It's called The Best a Man Can Get. It was quite interesting to go back and watch again. But man, when that ad came out in 19, it sparked a ton of controversy. The issue was, I think a whole lot of people felt that it unfairly characterized men, like generalized it. This is all they showed was the very worst parts of men. And yet, myself included, as I'm watching this, I'm like, that doesn't represent all that we do as guys. We're not walking around beating people up and bullying everybody, but the ad regardless still did a good job of showing what self-serving masculinity looks like. They really did. And I gotta tell you, when I went back this week and putting this together, when I went back and watched the ad again, guys, I was far less offended when I watched it this week than I was back in 2019. 2019, honestly, I was kind of pissed, as were a whole bunch of other guys, because again, it just seems so unfair. But looking back at it, I'm like, oh, They pretty much nailed it. They didn't nail it in terms of, hey, here's a representation of what most men are like, but what they nailed was some of the areas where there is absolute breakdown in the way masculinity is being walked out. So go back and watch it and check it out. Again, I think it's called The Best We Can, or Best Men Can Be, and Gillette, and you'll find that on YouTube. But here's the thing. The ad showed this. It showed people getting bullied, people objectifying women. It showed rage that was leading to violence. It showed substance abuse and just overall jackassery, as I like to call it. And in these scenarios, the men and the boys that were depicted in these scenarios were using their masculine power, not to benefit others, but rather to benefit themselves. They were using their masculine power not for somebody else's benefit, but for their own benefit, for their own appetites, their own desires, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about that today. But Gillette did a really good job, honestly, at pointing out the ways that the pendulum has swung away from the goodness that masculinity should bring to a society, and all the way from that to what it's become, that is in many cases self-serving and even toxic. I freaking hate the whole toxic masculinity thing. Not because there's not some truth to it, but man, it was like a juggernaut or a snowball. I think as soon as it came out, it was just so easy for people to reach out and grab and lob around, again, as if it applied to a whole lot more people than it really does. It led to it was the beginning of this demonization of masculinity as a whole. So this toxic masculinity just came out to become a diatribe against all masculinity, in my opinion. But regardless, Gillette did a good job of kind of exposing that. So here are some examples of this self-serving use of masculine power. As I mentioned, some of this stuff is going to be pretty intuitive to you, but maybe not. So first one that they showed in the video was bullying, right? So what is bullying? I did not pull any of these off of the interwebs, anything like that. These are just my own definitions, but I think that they'll be adequate for the sake of the conversation. So they showed bullying, and I've classified that as using someone's masculine power to elevate one's sense of power, dominance, or superiority, and usually it's over somebody more vulnerable than themselves. That just sucks. I mean, bullying is bad enough, but it's kind of sad when you think about it. Isn't it weird that bullying isn't about two equally matched people or guys, somehow taking it out on each other? It's not bullying. Bullying is actually by picking on somebody weaker than you or somebody perceived weaker. And that's just sad, man. It's that same kind of weird sickness. I mean, why is it that mass shooters always go into theaters or churches? You know why? Because they're always looking for a bunch of sitting ducks. And it's just a sad thing. I can live with a fair fight. This bullying thing just really sucks. And I will tell you, I did some bullying when I was a kid. It was never an extensive thing that, characterized my life, but I can remember being just a little turd. And I think I told you guys in one of the episodes that I was kind of violent as a little kid. I remember I would go out and pick fights at lunch and doing different things. And I had this idea that every kid that was fat, because I wasn't fat at the time, I got fat later. But I had this idea that fat kids were weak. And until I picked the fight with the wrong fat kid, and that kid, boy, punched me right in the mouth, split my lip open so bad I got my ass kicked by this fat kid. And thank God for it, because, dude, I had it coming, and it knocked me off my high horse and helped me to get out of the bullying thing. And then even in high school, I can recall me and another friend were teasing this girl. We were in a machine shop class, and it's pretty unusual to have a girl in there. And she was nice. She was sweet. Nothing wrong with her at all. Yet we started teasing her about some stuff. It wasn't anything heinous, but we pecked at her, enough to where the machine shop teacher eventually says, guys, this girl over here is really upset. And I think it was over a course of a couple weeks. I was being a total douchebag, but it didn't occur to me. It's sad. We don't always make conscious choices to go through and do something mean, but yet you can find yourself doing it. And so that machine shop teacher held us accountable. We got the message. I think we apologized to her. If I could do it again, I would. But again, it kind of points us right back to why it's worth us even having this conversation. Why are we going to talk about what self-serving masculinity is? Because sometimes guys don't realize they're doing it. Right? And not to mention, and we'll hit this one as we get towards the end of this podcast, not to mention that, we're not always thinking in these terms, yet many of us have sons. Many of us have grandsons. Many of us have friends that we might have the ability to speak into their life. And man, we never know that, just like that machine shop teacher saying something to us, we have got opportunities or will have opportunities to be able to say, hey man, this is This is not kosher. This is not the way you walk out your masculinity. So I'm glad. I'm glad that teacher talked to us, but I do feel badly that when it comes down to the bullying thing, I was that guy for a little while. So anyway, that's it. Bullying, using your masculine power to dominate, to show superiority, and it's usually over somebody more vulnerable than themselves. That's one of the things we saw in that Gillette commercial. We're talking about what is self-seeking masculinity. So bullying is one of the ways that it could show itself. Second, objectifying women. That is using masculine power and innate sex drive in passive and sometimes active ways, even to the point of sexual assault. It's objectifying women, which means it's like you view them kind of like a snack, something to be consumed and used to satisfy one's sexual appetite. And, many of us might say, well, hey, that's not me. That's never been me. I've never assaulted a woman. I've never been the offender with any unwelcome sexual advances, things like that. Listen, that may be true, but once again, guys, if you're a Christian, the bar has been raised much, much higher than that. When we talk about the objectification of women and how that is something that's a negative expression of your masculinity, then Jesus talked a lot about this stuff. The truth is, okay, if you're using pornography, is that not the objectification of women? Do we think that's some kind of a victimless crime, which is a horrible thing to say, but a lot of guys are like that. If they don't use those words, well, many of them would. I mean, I've done some reading and guys would say things like that, but it's a victimless crime. It's not hurting anybody. And yet the reality is, do any of us recognize that pornography is what fuels the human trafficking industry? Porn is the fuel for human trafficking. And majority of the time, where does the porn lead when it comes down to the human trafficking piece? Man, a whole lot of prostitution and, again, just a gross mistreatment of females. Even if they jumped into it themselves, many of them are blackmailed into the porn industry and into prostitution and things like that. But the point is, we're talking about what is the objectification of women. If you say, I've never attacked anybody, I've never raped anybody, that's great. But guys, if we are using porn at all, then we're the guys that are fueling sex trafficking, right? It's these types of things where the bar isn't just, hey, you didn't do anything. No, as far as Jesus is concerned, the bar is very, very differently than that. What did he say? And I think it's Matthew chapter 5, between chapters 5 and 7, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talked about this. He said, listen, you've heard it said, don't commit adultery. Jesus is raising the bar. He said, here's the issue, man. It's not just did you not put your hand on a woman. The thing is what's going on in your brain. Because the truth is, if we take a look at the Sermon on the Mount as it pertains to a couple different areas. And when we think about why was Jesus taking issue with the lusting in the heart, right? He said, you've heard it said, don't commit adultery. I'm telling you, don't lust after her in your heart. Why? Because if there's a seed to adultery, what are the seeds of adultery? Lust. That's where it starts. And that's why Jesus said, listen, deal with the seed. Don't lust after the woman, and you won't have to worry about adultery. And so the point here is when it comes down to the objectification of women, when it comes down to either utilizing your masculine power to assault or to attack or to just be uncool to a woman, that's only a piece and part of it. The objectification is still a negative use of our masculine innate sex drive, right? And that's just not what it's supposed to be used for. And we think so often, right, especially with these things that aren't readily visible. When we're talking about porn, we're talking about things that we think, the way that we might look at a woman in a store, we're thinking that's just between us, and maybe you're honest enough to say it's between you and God, and there's a problem, and we think it's a secret, but oftentimes it's not, because so often your wife knows what you're doing. She sees you, whether it's on a TV thing, she will catch you and oftentimes won't say anything because maybe she thinks you're not capable of anything better, or that you're just doing what every other guy does, or she's chosen not to fight the fight anymore. But they do see it oftentimes. And if they haven't seen it, they will more than likely eventually find out, and then you've got grief, you've got issues there. But they do see it. Jill and I, one time years ago, were in a restaurant, and this is something when it comes down to the objectification of women, and then for me, trying to learn to make sure that I was honoring my own wife with my eyes, and that I wasn't opening the door to me, again, starting to lust after a woman, whatever else. I began to really work towards controlling that aspect. I didn't want to look at girls. I want to be careful with it. So Jill and I are having dinner with a friend, and every time a woman would walk in, and this guy is a good dude, man. He loves the Lord, but every time a woman would walk in, you'd see him look up, and he didn't necessarily leer at her or something like that, but it was enough to where this guy did it. And heck, I've got friends today that are still doing the same thing, and some I've spoken to him about it. But after dinner that day, or that evening, Jill says, came up to me. She said, "You never look." And one, I'm like, "Well, thanks for noticing, man, because this is hard." But I told her, I said, "Yeah, it's hard, but I've disciplined myself and I'm not perfect at it, but I've made a lot of headway to where now a woman walks in, I don't feel compelled to look at her, or going down the street. And I don't get that right all the time. And I find that I've got some seasons where I've allowed myself to relax a little bit. And then I've become aware that, hey, this is kind of going on. You've gotten soft on it. Yeah. And I'll be vulnerable here. This is about wasn't long ago, maybe within the last year, but Jill and I were watching TV. And again, we're coming back down to one, where has Jesus placed the bar in terms of the things that you and I look at, where again, the big heading here is objectification of women. And it's not just about reaching out and touching them. It's about the things that are going on in our head. So yeah, within the last year, I was watching TV. And in this particular scene, there's a woman in there, and perhaps I would imagine she probably didn't have a bra on or something like that. And obviously, I was conscious of that. I mean, how can you not see that? And I'm a dude, so there's a part of my wiring. Now, I'm going to qualify that. That's not an excuse. That doesn't mean you just do it because you're a dude. No, I'm just acknowledging that there's something on the inside of me that likes that. That doesn't mean I have to give into it all the time. But so I noticed that. Well, God made it clear to me right as I'm watching TV. I kind of hear his voice in my head. He says, "What are you doing?" We didn't have to have a big conversation after that. The point is, God pointed out to me that, hey, man, you're lingering. You're looking on purpose. And your wife's sitting right next to you, and you guys are watching TV. You're watching a movie. And the point is, God asked me, he said, "What are you doing, man?" And so what was going on there? Well, what happened is I just got kind of lax. I didn't realize that. I was kind of slipping back into some old habits. And so my point is, guys, our wives do see, or they'll end up seeing, and then even irrespective of that, man, the Lord sees. And we want to be guys that are honoring God and honoring our wives in every way. We don't want to be objectifying a woman by the things that we do or say to them, but we also don't want to objectify them on our own hearts and our own minds. Why? Because it's not good. It's not what God has called us to. Do we get all right all the time? No, but we want to be men that are leaning forward and trying. Next, the other things that they showed was rage leading to violence in this ad, and you could see there were kids or guys just running full speed chasing another guy. While they were getting after him, and it was leading into a fight. But they showed this rage leading to violence. Again, what is that? We're talking about using masculinity or using masculine strength to dominate or show superiority, and it's often for the sake of one's own ego. I mean, I wish we could say that every time we got in a fight, it was because we were defending somebody weaker. I mean, and I will tell you, that's actually an appropriate use of masculine strength for the Christian man. But often it's not like that. The truth is, we're fighting many times when it's come up. We're fighting for the sake of our own ego. We got insulted. We got angry, and where do we see these things come up in everyday life? We see it come up in traffic, in road rage, those types of things. But more often than not, what we see is most fighting is not done for the sake of somebody else. Most fighting is just about rage, which is uncontrolled anger. We stepped over the line and gave into it. And that is, again, a very negative use of masculinity and a very negative use of masculine power. I'm not saying you never fight. There's a right time to fight, but it's not to defend your ego. I taught on this some time ago, but Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount talked about that. He said, if somebody strikes you on the left cheek, give them your right cheek, allow them to strike you again. When you think about that, if you go through the mechanics of it, if somebody is striking you on the one cheek, what he is describing is getting a backhand from somebody, which back in the first century, you would see this happen. For them, it wasn't a closed fist punch. The point was it was a grave insult, and oftentimes it was given by a Roman soldier or somebody else like that. But the intent was this was not a closed fist punch. This was meant to be just a grave insult. And Jesus' point would have been not that you never fight, but don't fight for the sake of your own ego, just because somebody insulted you badly. And I still struggle with that a little bit, just because I'm thinking, any guy slaps me on the face, we're going to have an issue. Help me, Lord, right? But his point is, don't fight for the sake of your ego. You and I are going to fight. Let it be because we're standing up for something that is righteous. We're protecting somebody else. We're doing something else that is much more honorable than just being pissed off because somebody insulted you or you got to prove who's who in this. But that's one of the other uses, right, of the self-serving masculinity. It's about my ego, and that's why we're going to fight here. And going back to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, it's interesting. He said, you've heard it said, don't murder. I'm telling you that anybody that hates his brother is already guilty of it in his heart. So go back to this seeds thing. Why is Jesus worried about hate? Because hate are the seeds of murder. If you take care of the hate, man, you're never going to get to the murder. And that's why Jesus said, let's not worry just about the action and just the thing that you're doing. I want you to think about the motivation that's in your heart. Fix your heart first. the other part's going to take care of itself. Next in the ad, it talked about, or they showed substance abuse, guys that were, correlating their masculinity to excesses in alcohol or illicit drugs, things like that, which can lead to more jackassery. And they were right. There's something to be said. Which of us haven't done that or been in that same space where either it's guys yelling chug, 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 or we're doing shots or we're doing some other thing. Listen, guys can pull that stuff off. It's just not really the intended use for masculinity as God has it laid out. And Gillette showed how a lot of guys can jump into that, and substance abuse and those types of things take you down a road that leads to overall jackassery oftentimes. So listen, here's the thing. Each of those examples, which none of those are a stretch. If you've been around at all, none of those are a stretch. They're not even unfair. I think we get this, that each of those serve the self at some point. Whether it's the objectification of women, that serves a guy's appetite, it serves a guy's own lust. Whether it is, rage that leads to violence, whether it is bullying, every one of those things serve the self. A guy is doing that because he wants to. And because they serve the self, at some point it means it's going to come at the cost of somebody else. Right? It's going to come at the cost of somebody else. The inappropriate use of masculine power to bully comes at the cost of that person. When it comes to the objectification of women, that inappropriate use of masculine power or innate sex drive comes at the cost of that woman. And when we look at this issue of rage that's leading to violence, that comes at the cost of the other guy. Why? Well, why is he paying that? What's he paying the cost for? For your ego to be satisfied. See, that is self-serving masculinity. It serves you, but it costs somebody else something. And listen, guys, the exercise of our masculinity under the masculine mission and in God's way, the exercise of our masculinity shouldn't cost anybody anything. Our masculinity should not cost anyone anything. And man, you want to talk about an important lesson for boys and other men? I mean, the idea that if your son understood, your grandson understood that son, you can take a punch and you're strong, you have endurance, you have all of these things, but I want you to get this, that the walking out of that masculinity should never cost anybody anything. Imagine what would happen if all the men in the world learned that one lesson. What if every man in the world didn't use his masculinity for the sake of his ego, for the sake of objectifying women? What if every man in the world did not use his masculinity to pick on somebody? There's 3 or 4 things. Imagine what would happen if every man in the world didn't do those things. What if he saved his masculinity for something that would give life and do good? Wow. And the truth is, we're not talking about that. That doesn't describe, some kind of a pussified masculinity. It doesn't, right? It actually describes one that is stronger, more under control. It's no less powerful. It's no less lethal. It just means that lethality, that type of expression is reserved for a very small segment of time. But when it's time to use that, you're able to. We'll talk about that in further podcasts. But listen, the exercise of your masculinity should never result in another person experiencing loss or pain. Good lesson for you, good lesson for your boys. The exercise of our masculinity should not cause fear. The exercise of your masculinity, again, you'll have to think through this because we may not recognize when we're exercising our masculinity. If your masculinity, your physical frame, your way, the fact that you have power or a loud voice, none of those things should cause fear. If it's causing fear, you're inappropriately using your power. Now listen, should our kids be a little afraid of us because they don't want to get spanked? Of course. Yeah, right. I'm not being stupid about this, but I think you guys catch this. The exercise of our masculinity shouldn't cause fear, but there is one exception. Really, there's only one person who should fear your masculinity or my masculinity, and that's the bad man. You see, the bad man should fear your power. The bad man should fear your righteous rage, if you will, or your righteous anger. You see, the bad man should fear you when you are acting as a force for good. There have been times, guys, as I've talked with many men, whether they were first responders, again, I've talked with many dudes from all different walks of life, and I would include myself in this. It's been hard to figure out, how do I untie the knot of all the fights that I've been in? How do I untie the knot that there's a little piece of me that likes the idea of getting violent? I get it. Not everybody's going to relate to this. Listen, I've been punched in the face, but I punched a lot of dudes in the face. I got scars all over my hands from teeth because I hit so many people in the mouth. Listen, there's a piece of me there's a part of me that kind of wants to get out that way. And And it's not something that I'm struggling with a lot, but over the course of the years, I and many guys like me have kind of thought, again, whether they like that idea or not, that there's just like this certain boiling stuff that's inside a dude. Some of that stuff is just testosterone, as we talked about in other podcasts. But there's something in there that just feels like, hey, I think it's inside every man to some degree. Some guys, it's not in there at all. And for some of you guys, that might mean that you need to grow in an area, not grow in an area of rage, but grow in an area maybe of courage, grow in an area of understanding your role. That there may come a time where you need to be willing and able to defend somebody you don't even know. Why? Because it's the right thing to do. Because you're a man. And you need to have strength and ability to jump into the fray when you need to. Not everybody's an Arnold Schwarzenegger or a Rambo. That's not the point. There's some of us are going to find that in the masculine mission, you need to up your game. You ought to up your game a little bit. Why? So that you could be a force for good in the middle of a really crappy situation. And for many of us, we've got to tone that part down. But my point here is this, that it's not as if there is no expression. There's no place for that part of the man to get out. There is a place for it. There's a category for it for a Christian man and under the masculine mission. Where's that category? That category is in my masculinity, and that type of masculine power is only to be used for the good of another, for somebody that's more vulnerable than me, right? And that means where there's an opportunity for me, I'm not necessarily it's a good opportunity, but if there's an opportunity or a need for a man to step in, to come up against a bad man, to come up against injustice, there's a place, there's a category for a man to use his masculine strength and power. And that's that category. So it's not that there isn't a place for that in the life of a Christian man. It's not that there isn't a place for that type of masculine power and expression of power, and even to some level of violence for the Christian man. But you got to place it in the right category. Where does violence not get used for the Christian man when it comes to defend your ego? That's not the right place for violence. But we use that stuff, again, in a very specific set of circumstances. All right, listen, that's about it for today. Grateful you guys tuned in. Hey, do me a favor. If you would, like, subscribe, whatever you're watching this on or listening to it on, and please share. My heart in this is I don't ever expect to make a dime. That's not the point. The point is I believe that there's a lot of redeeming value in the Word of God and redeeming value in this message. That is that there's a way for us to walk out masculinity that brings good to the world. So if you would like, subscribe, share, do whatever you got to do. Look forward to connecting with you guys next time. Be blessed.